Our next lesson for imperialism will take us to the continent of Africa. The big idea for this lesson is that European imperialist nations divided up the continent of Africa. The essential question: how did imperialist European powers claim control over most of Africa by the end of the 1800s? The aim of the lesson: explain why European contact with Africa increased during the 1800s and understand how Leopold II started a scramble for colonies in Africa. Let's set the stage. In the late 1800s, Britain, France, Germany, and other European powers began a scramble for African territories. Within about 20 years, the Europeans had carved up the continent and dominated millions of Africans. How did European contact increase in Africa? First, explorers advanced into Africa's interior. In the early 1800s, European explorers began pushing into the interior of Africa. They were fascinated by African geography, but they had little understanding of the peoples they met. Second, missionaries follow explorers. Protestant missionaries sought to convert people to Christianity. They built schools and medical clinics alongside churches. The missionaries viewed Africans as children in need of guidance. To them, African cultures and religions were inferior. They urged Africans to reject their own tradition in favor of Western civilization. Dr. David Livingstone is the best-known explorer and missionary. For 30 years, he crisscrossed Africa. Dr. David Livingstone was a Scottish medical missionary and the first European to do humanitarian and religious work in South and Central Africa. He wrote about the many peoples he met with more sympathy and less bias than did most Europeans. His whereabouts became the subject of major newspaper articles when it was reported that he had not contacted anyone in 6 years. This captured the imagination of the public. In 1869, journalist Henry Stanley trekked into Central Africa to find Livingstone. When he finally tracked him down, in 1871, he greeted him with the now legendary phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." When Henry Stanley found Livingstone, he wrote a number of newspaper articles which created European interest in Africa. Stanley also sought the aid of King Leopold II of Belgium to explore and claim the Congo region. By 1880, Europeans controlled 10% of Africa. At the request of King Leopold II, Henry Stanley established trading stations, signed treaties with African chiefs, and claimed land for Belgium. As a result, King Leopold set off a scramble for Africa. And nearly 34 years later, by 1914, Europeans controlled all of Africa except for Liberia and Ethiopia. How did King Leopold II set off a scramble for colonies in Africa? By sending explorers to the Congo and trying to establish treaties to dominate trade. As a result of King Leopold's actions in Africa, European powers met at an international conference in 1884. At this conference, they established the rules for conquest of Africa. It was a paper partition, sponsored by Otto von Bismarck. It sought to prevent conflict over imperialism. This encouraged the scramble for Africa. In the 20 years after the Berlin Conference, the European powers split up almost the entire continent. As Europeans carved out their claims, they established new borders and frontiers. They redrew the map of Africa with little regard for traditional patterns of settlement or ethnic boundaries. The Berlin Conference in 1884 was significant because it: A. established rules for the European division of Africa, B. promoted Belgium as a world power, C. called for war against England, D. ensured ethnic harmony in the Middle East. The answer is A. established rules for the European division of Africa. The next individual involved in African imperialism is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes became Prime Minister of Cape Colony, which is at the very southern tip of Africa, which will eventually be known as South Africa. He sponsored the Cape to Cairo Dream, where Britain would dominate the continent. The Cape to Cairo Railway was a project to cross Africa from south to north by rail. So this was a dream of Cecil Rhodes, where he wanted to connect South Africa with Egypt. When diamonds and gold were discovered, Rhodes wanted to extend his influence, but the region was controlled by the Boers. The Boers were South Africans of Dutch or German descent. This meant that their relatives were European. This led to two Boer Wars in 1880 to 1881 and 1899 to 1902. Massive British forces eventually defeated the Boers and in 1910 formed the Union of South Africa, which is at the very southern tip of the continent of Africa. The new constitution set up a government run by whites and laid the foundation for a system of complete racial segregation that would remain in force until 1993. Next, we're going to look at someone that goes by the name of Shaka Zulu. In the early 1800s, the Zulus emerged as a major force in southern Africa under a ruthless and brilliant leader named Shaka. Between 1818 and 1828, Shaka waged relentless war and conquered many tribes. His conquests, however, set off mass migrations and wars, creating chaos across much of the region. By the 1830s, the Zulus faced a new threat, the arrival of well-armed mounted Boers. The Boers were migrating north from the Cape Colony, escaping new British laws that abolished slavery and interfered with their way of life. The Boer migration was known as the Great Trek. As the migrating Boers came into contact with the Zulus, fighting quickly broke out. At first, Zulu regiments held their own, but in the end, Zulu spears could not defeat the Boer guns. Which slogan best reflects the point of view of Cecil Rhodes as shown in the cartoon above? A. Imperialism is a gorgeous pursuit. B. Embrace African diversity. C. Unite all Africans. D. Connecting Constantinople to Cairo. The answer is A. Imperialism is a gorgeous pursuit. Cecil Rhodes was a European imperialist. Which is an accurate statement about the partitioning of Africa by European imperialist nations during the 1800s. A. African unity was encouraged. B. New nations were based on old tribal boundaries. C. The continent was divided equally among the colonial powers. D. The cultural and ethnic diversity of the African people was disregarded. The answer is D. The cultural and ethnic diversity of African people was disregarded. How did imperialist European powers claim control over most of Africa by the end of the 1800s? At the request of King Leopold II, Henry Stanley established trading stations and signed treaties with African chiefs. This was one reason why the scramble for Africa began. 2. The Berlin Conference established the rules for conquest of Africa to prevent future conflict over imperialism. 3. Cecil Rhodes' dream of a continent controlled by Britain from Cape to Cairo. Let's answer our essential question. How did imperialist European powers claim control over most of Africa by the end of the 1800s? By the end of the 1800s, imperialist powers began pushing into the interior of Africa. Missionaries soon followed, trying to convert people to Christianity. To them, African cultures and religions were inferior. They urged Africans to reject their own traditions in favor of Western civilization. King Leopold II set off a scramble for colonies in Africa by sending explorers to the Congo and trying to establish treaties to dominate trade. This led to the Berlin Conference, which established the rules for conquest of Africa among the European powers. This is the end of the lesson. Please complete the assignment that goes with this lesson.